Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're stepping into one of the most unsettling stories ever whispered through the old towns of Massachusetts. The year was 1858, and the Putnam family lived in a house that locals swore was filled with rituals, strange gatherings, and nighttime practices no one dared to explain. Neighbors stayed quiet, the town lived in fear, and the truth was buried deeper than anyone realized. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe, because every video here takes hours of digging through rare archives, forgotten reports, and historical records to bring you stories most people have never heard. In 1858, the Putnam residents stood on the edge of a quiet Massachusetts town, a large, aging home with shuttered windows and a reputation that grew darker with every passing season. What first drew the town's suspicion wasn't screams, strange visitors, or even rumors, it was the lights. Soft at first, then unmistakable. Lights that never should have been there. Multiple neighbors reported seeing a glow that didn't behave like candle flame or lantern fire. Instead of flickering with the wind, it pulsed, bright, dim, bright again, as if responding to something or someone inside the home. Some nights the light was a deep orange, stretching across the windows like fire trapped behind glass. Other nights it shifted to a pale, unnatural white that illuminated the trees around the property, casting shadows that looked too tall, too stretched, too wrong. The lights often started after midnight, long after the rest of the town had gone still. People would wake to it unintentionally, a flash creeping across their bedroom walls, or a strange glow reflecting off the snow or dirt roads. Those who lived closest said the light sometimes formed shapes, as though someone inside the house was carrying something glowing room to room, yet no silhouettes ever crossed the windows. A few townspeople, curious or brave enough to investigate, claimed the lights didn't match anything they recognized. Lanterns were steady and yellow, candles flickered, fireplaces cast warm, uneven glows. But the Putnam lights looked almost controlled. Directed. As if someone was using them to signal, or communicate, or guide something unseen. One farmer who passed by the house late one night after tending his animals said the entire downstairs seemed to flash at once, a silent burst, like lightning without thunder, and then instantly faded. He described feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise before he even realized what he had witnessed. He kept his horse moving without looking back. Children walking to school in the early morning said they often found the windows slightly open, with no sign of who had touched them. Others swore they saw faint trails of smoke or steam rising from the house despite the fireplaces being cold during inspections. The strangest part. Every time someone gathered the courage to approach the Putnam property during one of those nighttime glows, the lights would instantly vanish, snuffed out as if the house itself sensed an intruder. The town, the message became clear: whatever the Putnams were doing in that house, they did not want anyone to see it, and the lights, those eerie, silent, impossible lights, were the first sign that something inside that home was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. If the strange lights brought suspicion to the Putnam home, it was the sounds that truly terrified the town. By the summer of 1858, more and more neighbors admitted they had heard something drifting from the property late into the night, not voices at first, but a low, rhythmic hum. Something that seemed too organized to be an accident, and too unnatural to be ordinary conversation. Most people described it the same way: a distant, pulsing chant, rising and falling in perfect timing. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like any prayer the church recognized. The words were indistinct, almost swallowed by the walls of the house, but the tone carried, deep, rolling, and slow, like a repeated phrase spoken again and again by multiple voices. Some nights, the chanting was soft, barely loud enough to catch on the wind. Other nights it was unmistakable, drifting across the fields and into the neighboring houses. Families would lie awake, staring at their ceilings, waiting for the sound to stop. But when it did stop, it stopped suddenly, as if someone inside the Putnam residence had snapped their hand through the air and silenced the room. One elderly woman who lived closest to the property swore the chanting always began the same way, with 3 knocks. Not on her door, not on the road, but from inside the Putnam home. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, followed by a stillness so perfect it made her chest tighten. Then the voices would begin. A group of schoolboys claimed they heard the sound one evening while returning home late from a nearby farm. They described the chanting as circling, seeming to move around the house rather than come from a single room. One boy said it felt like the voices were following them as they walked, growing louder as they slowed their pace, then fading when they ran. Adults dismissed the boy's story at first, until more people began reporting the same uncanny experience. By autumn, townsfolk stopped walking near the Putnam house after dark entirely. Even the bravest fathers refused to bring lanterns close to the property line. The chanting had become a nightly event, sometimes only a few minutes long, sometimes lasting nearly an hour, but always with that same strange rhythm, that same eerie harmony, as if several people were reciting from the same hidden script. The local pastor tried to investigate, convinced the family was practicing some form of forbidden ritual or foreign rite. But every time he approached the property, the chanting immediately ceased, replaced by a silence so suffocating he later admitted it felt deliberate, as if the house knew he was coming. What unsettled him most wasn't the voices, but what he felt when they stopped. A pressure in the air. A coldness that didn't match the season. A sensation that someone, or something, was standing just out of sight. The town kept quiet, pretending not to hear, but inside their homes people whispered the same fear. Whatever the Putnams were chanting, it wasn't meant for human ears. Before 1858, the Putnam household was known as a place that often received visitors, traveling merchants, distant relatives, hired workers, even curious townsfolk who came by for business or social calls. But as the months passed, something changed. People began to notice that those who entered the Putnam home did not always come back out. The first disappearance barely caused a stir. A young man from a nearby town, a salesman known for his wandering lifestyle, was last seen walking toward the Putnam property one late afternoon. Most assumed he continued on his route. But when his employer sent word weeks later asking if he had passed through, the town realized he had vanished without a trace. The Putnams claimed they never saw him. Then came the second disappearance, a seamstress who was hired to mend dresses for the family. She had been inside the home several times before, always returning home just before dusk. But on one chilly evening, she never arrived back at her parents' house. Her mother insisted she had walked toward the Putnam residence earlier that day. The Putnams again denied she had visited. Her work basket was later found resting neatly on the edge of the woods, as if placed there deliberately. The third case shook the town. A hired handyman, well-liked and familiar to nearly every family, had been repairing fences along the road near the Putnam property. He was spotted speaking to a member of the Putnam family at their gate just before nightfall. By morning, he was gone. No tools left behind, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just absence. His disappearance couldn't be dismissed as travel or misfortune. Neighbors whispered that he had been invited inside. After that, rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed they heard loud, hurried footsteps on the Putnam porch late at night. Others said they saw shadows moving behind the curtains even when the lights inside were dim. A few insisted they saw someone standing in an upstairs window, someone who didn't resemble any known member of the household. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every person who vanished had walked toward the Putnam house. What disturbed the townsfolk most was the Putnam family's silence. They did not defend themselves, nor express worry, nor ask for help searching. Instead, they behaved as though nothing had happened. They continued their daily routines calmly, quietly, almost rehearsed, as though they knew the town was watching, and didn't care. Eventually, the townspeople stopped going near the property unless absolutely necessary. Delivery boys left packages at the gate and ran. Families crossed the road to avoid passing the house entirely. Even the sheriff, normally confident and outspoken, refused to confront the Putnams directly. He simply repeated that without evidence, his hands were tied, but evidence didn't matter anymore. Fear had already filled the void. By the end of the year, the town had reached one terrifying conclusion, one that no one dared speak out loud but everyone silently believed. People weren't just disappearing near the Putnam house, they were disappearing because of it. As fear around the Putnam household grew, the town's attention gradually shifted to the children, because they were the only members of the family who regularly appeared in public. Normally, children brought a sense of innocence wherever they went. But the Putnam children didn't inspire comfort. They inspired unease. People first noticed it at church. The three Putnam children would sit perfectly still through the service, too still. While other children fidgeted, whispered, or played with their shoes, the Putnam children sat with their hands folded, eyes straight ahead, barely blinking. Their expressions did not change, not even during hymns or sermons that usually stirred strong emotion. It was as if they were listening for something else entirely. Then the whispering began. Multiple churchgoers claimed they heard the Putnam children speaking in low, rapid tones to one another, not during playtime, not outside, but during the quietest portions of service, when no one should be talking. When people tried to listen closely, the children would instantly fall silent and turn their heads in perfect unison, giving the impression they had been caught, or interrupted. In the marketplace, their behavior was even stranger. They often walked in a straight line, never breaking formation. If one stopped, all stopped. If one turned, all turned at the exact same moment. They seldom spoke to adults and never answered direct questions, not even simple ones like, "How are you?" or "Where are your parents today?" Instead, they stared with a blank, almost distant focus, as though studying the person rather than listening. Local merchants told unsettling stories. One shopkeeper said the children entered his store without making a sound. They walked between the aisles, not touching anything, not looking at the products, just moving slowly through the room. He claimed the youngest child paused at a shelf of mirrors and stared at her reflection for nearly 5 minutes without movement, until one of her siblings gently tapped her shoulder and silently guided her out. Another merchant said he caught the children standing outside his shop early one morning before he opened, lined up shoulder to shoulder, watching the sunrise with identical expressions. When he cleared his throat to greet them, they turned their heads toward him, together, at the same angle, the same speed. He said the gesture chilled him more than anything he'd witnessed in years, but what scared the townspeople most was how the children reacted to sounds. Loud noises, especially sudden ones, didn't make them flinch. Instead, they tilted their heads, as though analyzing the noise rather than being startled by it. A dropped bucket, a barking dog, a slamming door, all prompted the same unnerving response. The town doctor, after observing them one afternoon, said privately that their behavior reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, not illness, not shock, but something learned. Something taught, something practiced. Parents began pulling their own children away whenever the Putnam siblings approached. Schools subtly discouraged them from attending group lessons. The pastor attempted to speak to their mother, but the children always stepped between him and the doorway, silent and watchful, preventing any conversation. By winter, the children were no longer seen as merely odd. They were seen as warnings, living signs that whatever was happening inside the Putnam home was affecting them in ways no one could understand. For decades, the Putnam house stood abandoned on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut by authorities who never publicly explained why. Nature reclaimed most of the property, vines crawling up the walls, shingles rotting, floorboards sagging under the weight of time. But despite the decay, no one dared enter. Children avoided it on dares, travelers hurried past it, and locals treated it like a silent landmark of fear. It wasn't until many years later, long after the Putnam family had vanished, that the truth about the house's deepest secret finally came to light. A severe storm had ripped through Massachusetts, damaging the structure so badly that the town council ordered it to be torn down. A small group of workers was assigned to handle the demolition, believing they were dealing with nothing more than an old, unstable building. They were wrong. The first strange sign came when they removed the floorboards in the dining room and discovered a section that sounded oddly hollow when tapped. Beneath the planks, they found a concealed trapdoor, heavy oak reinforced with iron, sealed so tightly it required crowbars and 3 men to pry it open. Dust poured out in thick clouds, carrying with it a smell that none of the workers could place. Not rot, not mildew, something metallic, cold, almost medicinal. When they finally pulled the door aside, they looked down into near total darkness. What they had uncovered was a narrow staircase leading into the earth, its stone walls damp and lined with scratch marks and hand-pressed smudges that time had failed to erase. The steps were unnervingly steep, as if built for secrecy rather than safety. Each man hesitated before descending, but curiosity, or duty, eventually pulled them downward. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a room that should not have existed. It was too large to be a simple storage cellar. The ceiling arched high above their heads, supported by old wooden beams that had somehow remained intact. The walls were covered in faded chalk markings, symbols, circles, and shapes that none of the workers recognized. Some appeared to have been redrawn again and again, layered upon each other like desperate attempts to get them perfect. Others looked unfinished, smeared by hands or rubbed away in haste, but the centerpiece of the room was what truly froze them in place. A large wooden table sat in the middle, bolted to the floor, chains, light, rusted, and broken, hung from its sides. Not heavy shackles, not tools of obvious violence, but restraints all the same. On the surface, the table bore long scratches, as though something had either been dragged across it or had clawed at it in panic. Beside the table were several shelves containing objects too old to identify, glass jars coated in dust, melted candle stubs, small wooden boxes with locking mechanisms long rusted shut. Some boxes rattled when lifted, Others were eerily silent. One worker found a stack of thin, decaying papers in a corner, the writing smudged beyond recognition. The only legible part was a date, 1858. The men said the air in that room felt different, heavier, colder, and strangely charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath after decades of silence. One described feeling watched from the corners of the room. Another refused to continue working, climbed the stairs, and quit the job on the spot. When the demolition was complete, no official record of the basement room was ever filed. The town chose silence, the same silence that had protected the Putnams for so long, but the workers who discovered the room never forgot it. They all described the same final sight before the house was torn down, the hidden chamber, still intact beneath the ground, swallowed by darkness again as rubble fell over it, as though the earth itself wanted to keep whatever happened down there buried forever. As the fears surrounding the Putnam family grew, the town's clergy became increasingly alarmed. Strange lights, unexplained chanting, disappearing visitors, and the unsettling behavior of the children were becoming too much for the community to ignore. The whispers reached the church steps every Sunday morning, carried by trembling voices and avoidant eyes. Eventually, it fell to the pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Hale, to confront the growing unease head-on. Reverend Hale had served the town for nearly 25 years. He was a rational, steady man who believed every problem had a scriptural answer, every mystery a reasonable explanation. But even he admitted privately that something about the Putnam household made him uneasy. Their refusing to participate in community events, their children's blank, unblinking stares, and the way the air around their home felt unnaturally still, as if sound itself was reluctant to enter. One cold autumn evening, after receiving yet another frightened report about the chanting, Hale gathered his courage and approached the Putnam residence. Lantern in hand, he climbed the dirt path leading to the front door. The house appeared completely dark, its windows like empty eyes staring into the fields. Yet, the moment he stepped onto the porch, he felt it, a faint vibration beneath his boots, like the subtle hum of voices buried deep inside the floorboards. That he knocked 3 times. No response. That he called out politely. Still nothing. That as he raised his hand to knock again, the door creaked open just an inch, not wide enough to see inside, not wide enough to invite, only wide enough to warn. Cold air seeped through the gap, brushing his face like an exhale from the dark within. Hale tightened his grip on the lantern and spoke clearly, "I come only to offer prayer and guidance. Your neighbors are concerned." No footsteps. No whispers. But the door slowly closed again. That a deliberate refusal. The next Sunday, the Putnam family did not appear at church for the first time in months. Not the parents. Not the children. Not a single sign of them. Townsfolk exchanged glances from the pews, even the choir faltered mid hymn. Taking this absence as a sign, Reverend Hale decided to return to the home, this time with 2 other clergy members from nearby towns. The trio went during daylight, hoping sunlight would chase away whatever darkness lingered inside. But when they reached the property, something felt different. The shutters were closed. The yard was eerily quiet. Even the birds avoided the trees near the home. As they approached, Hale knocked again, firmer this time. The silence that followed felt thicker than before. Finally, the door opened, not by a person, but seemingly by itself, swinging inward slowly until the dim hallway was visible. They stepped inside. What they found unsettled them deeply. The walls were bare, yet carried a strange chemical smell. The floors bore scuff marks in odd, circular patterns, as if furniture had been dragged away hurriedly. And the air carried a faint echo, as though voices had been whispering moments before their arrival and had gone silent only because they entered. The clergy moved through the house calling out scripture, hoping to provoke a response from whoever was inside. Instead, the shadows seemed to deepen, and every word they spoke felt swallowed by the room itself. By the time they reached the back of the house, they found something even more disturbing: the children's footprints, dozens of them, circling near the pantry door in a pattern that made no sense. Yet there were no children present. No adults. No sound. No movement. The Putnam family was simply gone. The clergy left shaken, refusing to speak in detail about what they saw. But Reverend Hale confessed one thing to the town council: whatever that family was practicing, he whispered, it was not of the church, nor of this earth. After that day, no minister returned to the Putnam home. The church quietly advised families to keep their distance. And the clergy, usually fearless in the face of sin and suffering, avoided that property until the day it was eventually abandoned. That it was the first and last attempt at intervention. As fear around the Putnam household intensified, a new and deeply unsettling pattern emerged, one that convinced many townsfolk that something unnatural was unfolding behind the family's closed doors. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, with a few farmers complaining that their livestock were acting strangely near the tree line that bordered the Putnam property. Horses refused to walk past certain points. Dogs barked at empty air. Chickens scattered as if sensing something unseen. Then, the first discovery was made. Early one morning, a farmer's boy found several small animal bones arranged neatly at the edge of the woods. At first, the boy assumed some wild animal had simply dragged its meal to that spot. But what unsettled him, and later the entire town, was the way the bones were placed. Not scattered, not chewed, not left in a natural pile, but arranged. Carefully. Almost deliberately. As though someone had set them down in a specific pattern. The boy's father dismissed it as a prank. But within days, more findings surfaced. A group of older children gathering firewood stumbled upon what they described as little piles, near the same stretch of forest. Twigs, stones, and feathers placed in circular shapes, always with small bones at the center. The children ran home terrified, claiming they heard faint sounds coming from deeper in the woods, soft, rhythmic taps, like someone knocking on a hollow log. Adults investigated but found nothing except more of these unsettling arrangements, always in different shapes, always pointing subtly toward the Putnam house, as if marking a path or boundary. No one dared follow it. As autumn deepened, the sightings increased. Farmers found clusters of objects, fur, leaves, feathers, left neatly beside their fences. Hunters stumbled upon strange clearing spots in the woods where the ground looked disturbed, as though someone had knelt there repeatedly. Even traveling merchants passing through town reported seeing odd patterns along the roadside near the Putnam property, describing them as signs someone had left, but not signs meant to be read by ordinary folk. What frightened the townspeople most wasn't the presence of these objects, it was their consistency: same style, same placement, same eerie precision, and every single arrangement seemed to form a loose path leading, directly or indirectly, back to the Putnam home. One night, a local man named Cooper, known for his bravery and loud opinions, decided he would solve the mystery himself. After hearing of another sighting near the riverbank, he took a lantern and walked the perimeter of the Putnam land. Hours later, he returned pale as chalk, refusing to speak. When pressed by neighbors, The only thing he would say was, they weren't left by accident, and they weren't left by anything wild. For the town, that was enough. Families began locking their doors earlier. Farmers kept their children close. And every time a new arrangement was found, the person who discovered it would quickly brush it away or bury it, as though destroying the evidence might somehow keep whatever was responsible from returning. Yet even as the townspeople tried to ignore them, the message behind the remains became clearer with each passing month. Someone, or something, was marking the land, and every sign pointed back to the Putnam family, as if the surrounding woods themselves were trying to warn the town about what lived inside that house. By the winter of 1858, the Putnam family was no longer just a subject of gossip, they had become the silent, consuming dread at the heart of the entire town. What began as odd lights and whispers had grown into something far more alarming. Incidents were no longer isolated or easy to dismiss. They were connected, escalating, intensifying, and the worst part was that nobody knew what the Putnams truly wanted, or what they were preparing for inside that shuttered house. It started with the nights people reported waking at the same exact time, 3:11 a.m., without reason. Entire streets claimed that on certain nights, their clocks stopped briefly, only to resume minutes later. Dogs howled in unison, even those kept indoors. Lantern flames flickered violently without wind. Families began sleeping with windows locked, curtains drawn, and lamps burning until dawn. Then came the sounds, not just chanting anymore, but thuds, dragging noises, and what several townsfolk described as heavy pacing echoing from the Putnam property. These noises carried unnaturally far, traveling across fields as though amplified by the land itself. Some nights the pacing grew so loud that people living nearly a mile away swore it sounded like footsteps on their own porches. Fear turned to vigilance. Men who once mocked the stories now refused to walk home without company. Mothers kept their children indoors after sunset. Even the sheriff, usually confident and dismissive, began patrols near the Putnam house, though he never actually approached it. He simply passed by from a distance, avoiding eye contact with the windows. Businesses felt the impact too. The marketplace grew emptier. People left early, avoiding dusk. The blacksmith, normally open until late evening, shut his doors an hour before nightfall. Even the tavern, the heart of community life, saw fewer patrons, as locals preferred the safety of their own hearths to the dark walk home. And then came the sightings. A traveling peddler claimed he saw figures standing behind the second-floor windows, motionless silhouettes, too tall to be the children, too still to be natural. A neighbor swore he saw someone crouched near the property fence at dawn, as if waiting, only for them to vanish when he blinked. Another family said they saw small, flickering lights weaving through the trees at night, not lanterns, not fireflies, but something that moved too purposefully to be either. The Putnams themselves did nothing to ease the town's fear. They did not greet neighbors, they did not shop in town, they did not attend church, they simply vanished into their home for weeks at a time. Every attempt to check on them, by officials, clergy, or even brave locals, was met with silence behind the door. Not a whisper. Not a footstep. Not even a shadow crossing the curtains. It was as though the family had retreated into the house completely, or something inside had swallowed them whole. By now, the fear had become a presence, a quiet, invisible fog hanging over the entire community. The Putnam house had transformed from a simple residence into a dark landmark of dread, a place children whispered about and adults avoided even by daylight. No one knew what was happening inside, but one thing was certain: every incident was a warning, and the warnings were getting louder, and the townspeople, for the first time in their lives, began to wonder if the Putnam family had opened a door, and if whatever was behind it was starting to seep out. Among all the rumors and whispers surrounding the Putnam household, the most damning and terrifying account came from someone who had actually stepped inside the house, a servant named Abigail, who had been employed by the family for several years. She was known in town as a quiet, reserved woman, deeply religious, and careful with her words. People trusted her. But when she spoke about the Putnam home, her voice shook, and she refused to look anyone in the eye. According to Abigail, the household was far stranger than anyone could have imagined. She described the interior as cold and shadowed, even in the middle of summer, with corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should, and ceilings that pressed down as if alive. She claimed the Putnams themselves rarely spoke to her directly. Instead, they communicated in whispers, gestures, and coded movements that left her perpetually on edge. What haunted her most, she said, were the late-night rituals. She had been forced, in hushed tones and under threat of dismissal, to carry trays of objects, candles, and books into certain rooms where the family would gather. She could not understand what they were doing. They never read from books aloud in any recognizable language. They didn't pray in any way she knew. Instead, they moved in synchronized motions, standing and kneeling, circling certain symbols drawn on the floor, murmuring in unidentifiable tones. Abigail admitted she witnessed strange effects on the Putnam children. They seemed altered during these gatherings, their eyes wider, their movements sharper, and their whispers echoing faintly in ways that made her skin crawl. On one occasion, she recalled a child's voice repeating a phrase she did not recognize, even though the child's lips never moved. She described it as the air itself speaking through them. The most harrowing memory Abigail shared involved a hidden room deep within the house, a room she had been told never to enter. On one night, a door was left slightly ajar, and her curiosity forced her closer. Peeking inside, she claimed to have seen symbols etched into the walls and floor, small collections of objects arranged in geometric patterns, and candles illuminating a circle in which the family moved with intense focus. She said the air inside the room was unnaturally cold, and she felt a presence pressing against her chest, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her gaze. Terrified, Abigail fled before anyone noticed her. She confessed to leaving employment soon after, her hands trembling whenever she recounted what she had seen. She said she could not sleep for weeks, haunted by the flickering candlelight, the unrecognizable words, and the silence of the Putnam children's stares. Her confession to a trusted neighbor finally reached the town, confirming what many had feared: the disturbances were not imagined. Something dark, methodical, and incomprehensible had been occurring within the walls of the Putnam home, and the servant who witnessed it could not escape its imprint on her mind. Abigail's story became the first concrete testimony that validated years of rumors. Her account left the townspeople in a state of silent terror, reinforcing the belief that the Putnam family's household had crossed a boundary no one else dared to approach. By late 1858, fear of the Putnam household had grown to a point where whispers were no longer enough. One autumn night, an event occurred that forced the entire town to confront the house, or at least, the terror it had come to represent. It began with the lights. Neighbors reported strange glows flickering through the windows, far brighter than usual. But this time, the lights moved violently, as if someone, or something, inside was struggling, pacing, or performing some frantic ritual. The hum of chanting Abigail had described reached an audible level, echoing across the streets, mixed with an unidentifiable thrum, almost like a low vibration in the earth itself. People gathered in the streets in fear, some clutching lanterns, others holding children close. Curiosity battled dread, and for the first time, a crowd formed. No one wanted to step too close, yet no one could ignore the spectacle. From porches and doorways, townsfolk watched in silence, hearts pounding as the lights shifted from room to room, revealing fleeting glimpses of the Putnam children, standing unnaturally still, as if frozen in mid-motion. Then came the sound that made the event unforgettable, a scream, not a child's cry, not a normal human wail, but something that clawed at the edges of perception. It echoed through the night air, reverberating off the nearby trees and houses. Windows rattled. Dogs barked wildly. Even the bravest men felt an instinctive urge to flee. The crowd remained, unable to look away. Shadows moved behind the windows, figures bending and swaying, their motions synchronized in a way that made the event feel orchestrated rather than accidental. At times, it seemed as if the figures disappeared entirely, leaving only the lights, the chanting, and the oppressive silence that followed each pause. Some townspeople later swore they saw objects levitating briefly, candleholders, small chairs, books, though others dismissed it as fear-fueled imagination. But everyone agreed on one thing: whatever occurred inside that house that night was no ordinary family gathering. It was deliberate, intentional, and terrifying. By morning, the crowd dispersed, shaken and silent. No one had dared enter. No one had called for the authorities. And the Putnams themselves seemed untouched, retreating behind their doors as if nothing had happened. Yet the memory of that night lingered, spreading quickly through the town. Families whispered warnings to one another, children were forbidden from passing the property, and even those who had previously doubted the stories admitted the house was far darker than any tale could convey. From that night onward, the Putnam residence became more than a home. It became a symbol of the unknown, a place the townspeople could neither understand nor confront, yet could never ignore. By early 1859, the Putnam household had become the subject of fear, suspicion, and whispered speculation across the entire town. Strange lights, chanting, unexplained disappearances, and eerie behavior of the children had created a tense atmosphere that no one could ignore. Then, as suddenly as the chaos had escalated, the family vanished. It began with a quiet morning. Neighbors noted that the front gate, which had always been slightly ajar, was now latched shut. Windows that once reflected flickering candlelight now showed only the dull gray of the early winter sky. A few locals passed by to see if anyone was home, but the doors were locked, the shutters drawn, and the yard completely silent. No smoke from the chimneys, no sounds of footsteps, not even a dog barking. Within days, it became clear, the Putnams were gone. The departure was abrupt. There were no preparations that anyone could see, no wagons, no packed belongings, no evidence of a journey. Personal items were left untouched, meals cold on the table, the children's shoes still lined up neatly by the door. It was as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. The townspeople were alarmed. Some speculated the family had fled in the dead of night, escaping accusations or scrutiny. Others whispered darker possibilities, that whatever force the Putnams had been involved with had claimed them, or that they had been hiding something in the house that allowed them to leave without a trace. Even the clergy were at a loss, expressing concern and fear that the house itself had become a conduit for something beyond human understanding. Searches were conducted, but no trace of the family was found. Fields, roads, and surrounding towns were combed, but the Putnams seemed to have disappeared entirely. The children were never seen again. The servants, neighbors, and local authorities could only speculate, but all accounts agreed on one terrifying detail: the house remained fully furnished, untouched, as if waiting for the family's return. In the months and years that followed, the Putnam residence became a symbol of mystery and dread. Travelers avoided the area. Children were warned not to stray near the property. Even adults, curious by nature, hesitated to investigate. The house itself seemed to loom over the town, a silent reminder of the family that had once inhabited it and the unknown forces that might still linger within its walls. No letters, no messages, no sign of where they had gone. Their disappearance was complete. The town's imagination filled in the gaps, giving rise to countless legends, some claiming the family had been spirited away by supernatural means, others insisting they had left under some dark and secretive plan. Whatever the truth, the abrupt disappearance left the town with an undeniable feeling: the Putnams had crossed a line, and whatever darkness had surrounded them did not leave with their bodies. After the abrupt disappearance of the Putnam family, the town was left with more questions than answers. Fear and curiosity pressed heavily upon the local authorities, prompting them to launch a formal investigation. What followed, however, only deepened the mystery. Records show that the sheriff and a small council of town officials visited the property soon after the family vanished. They catalogued the house, noting the untouched meals on tables, beds neatly made, and the unusual alignment of objects in certain rooms. The documents they compiled were meticulous in description, yet disturbingly vague on interpretation, a reflection of both the strangeness of what they found and their reluctance to assign blame or explanation. Among the findings noted were the lights reported by neighbors, described in official language as unexplained luminous phenomena, and the chanting the townsfolk had heard, recorded as auditory disturbances without identifiable source. The behaviors of the Putnam children, observed before the family disappeared, were also included, though investigators struggled to provide any rationale, instead documenting them as peculiar, possibly influenced by unknown factors within the household. Most striking were the entries regarding the hidden basement room. The sheriff's notes described the concealed trapdoor, the narrow staircase, and the large chamber below, with its etched symbols and organized arrangement of objects. These passages are unusually cautious in wording, often marked by phrases such as "cannot explain," "undetermined purpose," and "requires further observation," though no follow-up investigation is ever documented. After compiling their report, the documents were sealed. The official explanation cited the sensitive nature of the findings, and the records were locked away in the town archive. The language in the sealing statement hinted at fear as much as discretion. The officials noted that the events may cause unnecessary alarm to the public if released, suggesting that even those in authority were unsettled by what they had seen. Over the years, rumors swirled that the sealed documents contained descriptions too disturbing to share publicly, accounts of strange markings, inexplicable events, and possibly evidence of ritualistic practices. Some townsfolk whispered that the investigation had uncovered the very truth behind the Putnams' disappearances, and that the documents remained sealed to protect the living from knowledge best left forgotten. Despite being officially hidden, fragments of the reports leaked over time through descendants of the officials and curious researchers. These fragments described rooms that defy logical understanding, objects arranged in patterns suggestive of intent, and observations of the Putnam children that hint at influence beyond normal upbringing. To this day, the sealed documents remain one of the few tangible links to the horrors and mysteries of the Putnam household. They stand as silent witnesses to a case that terrified an entire town, a case where rational investigation could neither explain nor contain what had occurred. The secrecy surrounding them only added to the legend. Whatever was recorded inside those pages was considered too dangerous, too powerful, or too incomprehensible to see the light of day. Even decades after the Putnam family vanished, the house they left behind remained a shadow over the town, a structure that refused to be forgotten. By the late 19th century, most residents had moved on with their lives, but every child grew up hearing the same warning whispered by parents: "Do not go near the Putnam house." The message was simple, yet loaded with terror. And though the building eventually decayed, the fear it inspired never did. Stories of the house persisted in hushed tones. Travelers passing through the town spoke of strange glows flickering behind empty windows at night. Farmers told tales of objects moving inexplicably in abandoned rooms. Some claimed the very walls carried echoes of chanting and footsteps, heard only by the brave or the foolish who dared to linger nearby. The legend also became a cornerstone of local folklore. Children dared one another to approach the property, only to retreat at the first hint of a shadow or a sudden rustle in the trees. Adults, more cautious but equally unsettled, avoided walking past the house after sunset. Even historians and investigators who attempted to document the property found themselves reluctant to enter. Their notes often speak of an oppressive atmosphere and a sense of being watched, though they provide no explanation beyond personal intuition. The Putnam family, long gone, became almost mythic. Scholars who stumbled across references in old records speculated endlessly about the nature of their practices, the fate of the children, and the true extent of the family's influence over the house. Every fragment of evidence, the sealed documents, Abigail's testimony, the accounts of neighbors, hinted at something dark and methodical, something beyond ordinary understanding. Over time, the house itself fell into ruin. Roofs caved, windows shattered, and walls crumbled. Yet the legend endured, carried on in stories, letters, and warnings. People insisted that anyone who entered the property risked more than injury or fright. Some claimed the very air inside was wrong, that it carried echoes of the Putnam's strange rituals, and that the house had not forgiven those who dared to trespass. Even today, researchers, thrill seekers, and paranormal enthusiasts speak of the Putnam residence in hushed tones. The story has become a cautionary tale about curiosity, secrecy, and the darkness that can linger behind closed doors. While no living witness remains, the tale survives because fear has a way of outlasting time. In the end, the Putnam house is more than a building. It is a symbol of mystery, of terror, and of the unknown. Its legend reminds every listener that some histories are better left unexamined, some doors are better left closed, and some families, like the Putnams, leave marks on the world that even time cannot erase. And so the story continues, whispered from one generation to the next, a haunting echo of 1858, ensuring that the Putnam family's dark legacy remains forbidden, feared, and unforgettable.